Welcome to the Veriff Voices podcast, a collection of conversations with leaders from across the industry, sharing tips and valuable insight into shaping the future of online identity. This podcast is brought to you by the people of Veriff, rebuilding trust in the digital world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Veriff Voices, the podcast where we talk about technology, fraud, compliance, and all things related to identity verification. Joining me today is Suvrat Joshi, Veriff's Senior Vice President of Product, and a man who is ultimately responsible for driving the innovation that you've seen in Veriff's product suite to date. In this episode, which is actually part two of a two-parter, we're going to dive into the subject of bias in artificial intelligence and reinforced learning from human feedback. If you haven't listened to part one, featuring Suvrat, check that out after this one. That's where we spoke about Suvrat's career to date, market challenges, and the product development process. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive into this subject. Thanks for joining us again for part two of this, Suvrat. So I think let's jump into the first topic again, which is sort of around the topic of bias in artificial intelligence. What, in a general sense, what are sort of some of the biggest issues and threats resulting from AI bias? It doesn't necessarily have to be talking about IDV. I'm talking about in a wider sense as well here.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great prompt, Chris, to start off the conversation. Model bias is inherent to any sorts of AI work that happens. So it doesn't really depend on the application, as you were calling out. Yeah, it's definitely not IDV specific, but it really does happen in any sorts of AI applications, machine learning applications. And the challenge with that is, with some sort of a reinforced model learning, the models tends to drift. And with that, the outcomes that you're looking at with the same precision recall, I think all of those start to suffer. And eventually, if you don't take corrective action in whichever way that happens, then you're going to end up with wrong results, right? There's ample public examples, even in the latest iterations of generative AI, where sorts of the bad flavors start to get reinforced, and then they get amplified, and then all sorts of bad results come through. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's not specific to IDV. And anyone dealing with AI, ML, generative models, I just need to be very cognizant about it.
It sounds like a sort of a compounding issue in some senses, right? So there's a small problem that is something that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the more data is applied and so on. What are some of the problems then that businesses may encounter with sort of AI bias as they sort of adopt this technology more broadly? And what is it that sort of causes these bias in the first place, I suppose?
Yeah, so biases can happen in multiple ways, right? So maybe to start out with, potentially the sample set that was used for training might inherently be biased in some way. And then when the model sees it, it may not be able to adapt it to the real world. And then you start reinforcing it. And then before you know it, you are really off target in some ways. That's really one way that the bias can happen. But there's multiple other ways that can come in. For example, if seasonality is not taken into account, let's say the model is being trained just for, I've just taken an e-commerce example or a marketplace example. Typically in US markets, Thanksgiving through Christmas, or actually in global markets, tends to be an anomalous market, but that doesn't mean that rest of the year looks like that, right? So if that sort of a bias kicks in and the model then is trying to make some determinations in January, February, well, it's not going to look the same. So I think those sorts of bias do show up depending on the application and where things are being applied. So seasonality patterns, there's lots of ways that these bias can show up.
There may be instances where AI bias can actually be beneficial, maybe sort of speeding up decision-making, something like that possibly.
It's yes and no, but I'm mostly going to say no, to be honest, because for me, any form of model bias is really not healthy. Maybe in a short term, it works in your favor just because of the way the bias plays out. But honestly, inherently, it's not. If I were to translate that to real world or to translate that to almost human behavior, all of us have our own biases, but all of us need to be conscious about it and try to hack it and correct to it. And I think I would say that, while obviously there isn't that level of sophistication in a model, kind of applies the same way. It's a yes and no, but honestly, it's mostly no.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Is it possible to have a completely unbiased AI model? I mean, is that sort of the holy grail? Is it something that's even achievable, do you think, given that sort of humans are doing the early work into sort of the early, the data is coming from humans, human input and so on in the first place?
I think it's an awesome thing to aim for. And in an idealistic world, it is perhaps possible or achievable as a snapshot in time. So if you just take like a particular snapshot, potentially you might find places where the model is performing perfectly, right? But over a period of time, or if you take longitudinal data, which is data over a period of time, I would say that bias would automatically show up. And of course, there needs to be a feedback loop in order to correct that bias, right? And another way to look at it is, look, if the model was perfect and it stayed perfect, then you wouldn't need to tune it. You wouldn't need to revisit it, i.e. you build a model once and you're done for life. It never happens, right? And so inherently, there's going to be changes that are introduced either externally or internally, and then we need to make sure that it's accounted for. So I think bias is an inherent part of model development, model building, model maintenance, and yes, can aim for an optimal state, or in a particular snapshot, you might find that, but I think in the long run, it's just not going to happen.
Turning the conversation to IDV, then is the area that we work in, I suppose, with our business here. What are the types of biases that we would see in the sort of the modelling and the work that we do here, and such as sort of individual characteristics or sort of very ID documents that we see, for example? Is there anything in there that where bias is particularly prevalent, or where we work to try and avoid it possibly?
Yeah, without going into too many specifics here, and it's a brilliant prompt, by the way. I think bias can show up in almost every application, right? So initially, potentially from an extraction perspective, I think bias could show up there again just because of various things. Matching is another challenge. Verification is another challenge. I think just bias could show up in all sorts of these areas that we work on. And again, without going into too much specifics, it's a constant challenge, and we are on it, right? And then from one particular application that perhaps I would like to call out is on fraud, and fraud is a big part of our space, clearly, and all of us are working towards, not just us, but everybody in the space is working towards minimizing fraud in IDV. And that's one area we all need to be very cognizant of and be really aware of. And that's where I would say that bias does show up in terms of, again, the areas I talked about earlier: extraction, verification, matching, and so on.
I see. Okay. And what sort of methods can organizations employ to address biases in AI models? So sort of apart from replacing skewed training data sets, is there anything else that can be done? Is there what would you advise sort of organizations who may find themselves having to face this problem?
Again, an awesome question here. And I would say that taking a little bit more of a structured approach, and I'm not like really maybe laying out like the entire playbook for it perhaps, but maybe taking a simplistic but structural approach. I would say that it's important to understand and recognize the bias first. And that can again happen in multiple different ways. You need a golden data set, as it's called, but you do need that recognition of where bias is coming from. And you kind of identify that, and then you take corrective action, and then you kind of iterate on it over and over again. That's like a more structured approach. Like, I'm not saying anything that's like rocket science, it's well understood, but I do want to kind of restate it perhaps. And that's really the best way to address biases in AI models. Things could vary depending on the application. Of course, we are in IDV space and we have our own challenges, and there's other applications of model development, model building. And I've seen that in payments, I've seen that in advertising, I've seen that in commerce. All of them have their own challenges in different flavors, and it does show up. And you just need to kind of take a little bit more structured approach towards it.
Fair enough. And I think sort of turning that, I suppose, to what we do here at Veriff then, is how does our platform, what are the measures that we have in place to sort of account for AI bias and sort of issues that may spring from it? And how does that sort of impact the user experience? Obviously, without going into the full detail here, because it might be something that there's some IP issues and things like that. But is there anything that you could share that is sort of an example, I guess, of what you've just said about that kind of recognizing the problem, identifying it, and then going on that course correction?
Yeah, it's exactly what I talked about, which is about recognizing it, identifying it, and then helping us improve or remove the bias from our models. And again, without going into too much of proprietary data, fraud is definitely one of those areas that we use this technique in, or this approach. And again, it's not like it's fairly known in the industry. It's not like it's like a super proprietary thing there. And coming to your other question about the user experience and user models, one place, again, without going into too much of detail or super detail here, is each region has its own flavor of user experience because of various different reasons. And that's an area where we do find some elements of bias, and that we do come in and take this approach and try to train differently, or try to partition the training in a way that it helps us address regional specific behavior patterns that then remove those sorts of biases that a generic model might inherently have. So yeah, again, we do take those sorts of approaches both either on fraud or for user experience.
I know that just sort of shifting the conversation slightly, I know that some of the areas that we as a company have looked at is having this kind of this layer of human feedback, and that goes into sort of I guess a couple of levels really, so from the modelling and the construction of the data in the early stages, but also to the product later on as well. And I'd like to talk now, if possible, to about this sort of reinforced learning from human feedback, which I think for ease of anything else we'll sort of abbreviate to RLHF from now on, if that's okay. But would you mind just sort of spending a couple of minutes just explaining what that actually is, to be honest with you, and sort of some of possibly going into like what its limitations are, including the need for extensive data and things like that?
Yeah, I like the acronym RLHF. It's nice. So what it basically is, effectively using human feedback, as it says, or eyes on the data, if you will, or eyes on the model, that then feeds back into the model to either correct bias, as we talked about earlier, or to provide additional input that then helps refine the model, to direct the model, and then train it so that the right outcomes are achieved. That's basically what RLHF is all about, right? So essentially, you kind of inject human in the loop effectively in order to build a better model. That's really the outcome that we're all looking for.
And I think that must provide presumably a layer of reassurance to I mean, there's I think a natural suspicion around artificial intelligence in many circles, but probably the general public at large. You sort of you hear the horror stories about it, don't you, and things like that, about things that are happening. So do you think with our customers they get a level of reassurance then that there is this human involvement, and that we are constantly sort of modeling and refining the data to sort of better serve the needs that they have?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an essential part of building confidence. It's an essential part of tuning and improving, just so that we provide our customers that reassurance that that it's not just it's just something running on autopilot, for example, right? And we have also, like you said, there are all sorts of negative examples out in the press and in other applications where that happens. So just having these humans in the loop and eyes on the ball or eyes on the model, I think is really great way to reassure customers that there is more than just a automated process that's running. Yeah.
Specifically to applying it, I guess, to the use cases and the industries with which we sort of have the most input into. So I think talking about fintech and gaming, healthcare, things like that. Are there any specific use cases there that you've seen for the RLHF and how it can sort of provide some benefit there?
Yeah, absolutely. And you definitely hit upon some of these gaming, fintech, healthcare are all amazing use cases. There's other use cases for these models for sure. Payments is one amongst them. Advertising is another one amongst them that I've definitely seen, and abuse, right? So I won't call it fraud, but it's really abuse or product abuse. For example, in social media cases, right? I think it's a really good one that's widely used also, and they do need a lot of humans in the loop in order to provide that reinforced learning or feedback to kind of start capturing some of these trends and yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably one that's across the board, isn't it? But to sort of differing degrees, I guess, depending on which vertical and what your use case is. But what is the sort of the role that human feedback plays then in sort of training these the models that we're using? Like how does it actually work, I guess, is what is the question I'm getting at here.
Yeah, definitely. So again, I'll try to keep it simple and structured. Obviously, there's a lot more complexity behind the scenes here. So effectively, if you think about training a data model, right? There's a data set, it's labeled, it's got attributes associated with it, and you kind of run model training, and the model learns, and then you create a model which is then run in production. And so the place where humans come in is this labeling and attribution. Again, I'm trying to keep it simple and structured here. And humans coming in can add to that labeled data set in order to enrich it, augment it, or at times even correct it. And that really is helpful because that feeds into, or that serves as an input to the model. And then the model that much becomes better or smarter. And then the output is that much better. And of course, like we talked about earlier, this is a continuous cycle, right? It's continuous loop. And that's exactly why this term reinforced learning, which is you're reinforcing that learning. But then there's humans in the loop, which is the human feedback. It comes into play, or RLHF as you nicely coined it. It really comes into play where humans are in the loop, making those annotations, if you will, data labels, if you will, that then helps the model be that much better.
Excellent. And just tying this back to what we started the conversation of around the sort of issue of bias then, is this something that can help eliminate bias? I guess that's that if you've got that sort of oversight there and looking at that kind of, the attribution especially, is there anything there that can kind of remove bias from it, or is that something that we can tie these two together?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why these two topics are so nicely connected together. yes, you can definitely remove the bias. I would go back and say that I think achieving a perfect model output all the time over a period of time is hard, as we talked about earlier. It's never impossible, and it's a great thing to aim for. It's never hard. And that's why this human in the loop or some sort of annotation, augmentation is always needed. And it's continuous learning, which allows the model to either stay on point or is improved over time.
I see. That makes sense. Yeah. And I think there's just looking at this in sort of the market context. How is reinforced learning from human behavior? How is that a differentiator for Veriff? I think it's not something that everybody does in this space, I think. So it's worth just sort of dwelling on that for a couple of minutes, I think, as to why our particular use case here is unique.
So there's systems out there or products out there that are almost fully automated, right? And what that means is they have a model, it's been tuned on some data, and you're going to throw it out in the real world, and it performs well in some cases, it doesn't perform well in others. And it's I would say it's a hit or a miss, but on an aggregate, it might still look okay. But when it comes down to a little bit more granular level, it's really hard. The place where a augmented model with human feedback, for example, in the loop kicks in, is really bringing the best in terms of what our customers look for. That's accuracy, improved fraud rates, better conversion, and offering that in a very competitive space is really awesome, right? And that's what we uniquely bring to the table. Having this human feedback in the loop, we can actually do all of that a lot better. And so for those places or those applications where you do need that higher precision, higher conversion rates, lower fraud rates, I think this is an essential part of the mix. And I would argue a lot superior to what a fully automated, no human involved sort of a picture looks like. And really all our customers and everybody in this space is looking for that, to be honest. And that's where an application and a product like Veriff's come into play, where we kind of offer best of both worlds, and it's really price competitive as well. So it's really a good combination of everything, to be honest, for our customers. Great value.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And I think I've sort of seen it in conversations with customers that I've had as well, is just, that ultimately what it comes down to is how well we do at preventing fraud, how well we do at making sure that that customers are compliant and so on. And if we have a system that is better at doing those things than others, then it has to be of better value, I think. So that makes perfect sense.
And our customers really appreciate that, right? Because that's exactly what we bring to the table. That value proposition is what the customer is looking for. And even if they start out with maybe other solutions which are kind of meet their needs in a basic way, they soon and very quickly outgrow it, because they do realize that those applications don't quite meet their needs, even though at a simplistic level it might look appealing. Honestly, it's not.
And I think just to sort of clarify as well, so we obviously do have a fully automated product ourselves that we use for different use cases and things like that. But it's worth pointing out that is what is being modelled on with the human feedback behind it. So it sort of has that robustness, I guess, that we're talking about here.
Yeah, you nailed it. What makes our automated solutions unique and rich is this exact human feedback in the loop. And of course, we use that sort of labeling and that enrichment globally for global data to actually, in a compliant way, by the way, in order to make those models better, in order to enrich those models. That does allow us to provide a superior product in the market.
Obviously, we're approaching the end of the year. What does 2024 bring, do you think, in terms of in the context of AI specifically, generally, but also in the world of reinforced learning from human feedback as well? Is there anything that you would sort of flag us to watch out for as we approach 2024?
That's nice. I love a crystal ball. Let's all figure that out. I'll give you my take on it. Generative AI is all the buzz, right, these days, and to want to kind of take that lens perhaps into the next year. There's tons of positive applications as well as negative applications of generative AI, I think, that can show up. Fraud is one that I think will see some negative applications of generative AI popping up in coming months and quarters. Not healthy, not great, but the application is there, and I can certainly see that coming through, and I think all of us need to be ahead of the curve on that one. And there are positive applications as well of generative AI kicking in. We are certainly looking at some, and I would love to bring that to our customers, of course, to enrich the product, to make it easier to use, both from a user experience perspective and customer metrics perspective that we talked about earlier, like conversion rates, like lower fraud rates and so on, higher accuracy as well. And so I think all of those mixes is going to kick in. And that's one trend that I would love to double down into. And I'm curious about how that evolves in the future, not just for our IDV space, but really across the board in other applications as well. So yeah, that's one I'm particularly excited about.
Excellent. Yes, it sounds like it's exciting times ahead for all of us, but particularly here at Veriff, because there is some big. I've obviously been party to the product roadmap that you're responsible for, your team, and there is some really big things on there that hopefully we can reveal in time. And it'd be great to get you back on actually to talk about those when the time's right, just to sort of share how we're doing with that kind of thing, and how AI is impacting the work that we're doing.
Yeah, certainly. I look forward to another session. It's really going to be exciting, and we can certainly double click into some of these areas, into how its application is or some of the ways we're applying it to our products. Absolutely, we can double click into those areas. I look forward to it, Chris. This has been amazing, and definitely look forward to the follow-up sessions.
Carl, thank you very much. Yes, thanks for joining us, Suvrat, and thank you everybody for listening. That's the end of our session.
This podcast is brought to you by Veriff. Identity verification made simple. Learn more at veriff.com.